We're ready to build our very first SharePoint Framework solution. And what we're going to be doing now is we're going to build a web part that's going to allow us to display some information on the page and test out some of the most basic features of the SharePoint Framework. It's actually very easy to get started in SharePoint Framework. All you have to do is jump into your terminal. And first of all, let's create a directory for us to work in. So we're going to create a directory called meter in this case. And let's go ahead and cd into that meter. And within this directory, we're going to run the Yeoman generator, or the yo command. And the generator we're going to use is the one we installed called Microsoft/SharePoint. And whenever we run this command, we get a nice little generator wizard, if you will, that's going to ask us some questions about the solution that we're building. For the most part, we're going to accept the default values here. We're going to have a solution name of meter. We're going to choose default SharePoint latest, use the current folder. The default option for the tenant admin, and we are building a web part in this case, so we're going to choose that. And I'm not going to use hello world. I hate hello world examples, so we're going to use a real example in this case. Our web part name is going to be called meter, and we'll leave the default description, and we're going to choose no JavaScript framework. We're going to come back to this in a later lesson, but for now we're going to choose the most basic option. It's going to run through and install all the NPM dependencies and packages that we need. It is setting up our solution folder and setting up everything we need to be able to build and work in our new SharePoint Framework web part. This is going to take just a few minutes, so we're going to speed it up here and we'll come right back as soon as it's done. Great, so we are all done. You can see you get a nice little congratulations message there, which makes you feel very good, like you accomplished something. And you see there it says run gulp serve to play with it. And we're going to do that in just a moment. But first, if this is the very first time you've ever developed a SharePoint Framework solution, you should run one command, which is gulp trust dev cert. And all this does when you run this is it installs an SSL certificate so that you can serve up the local development server over HTTPS, which you should do. And that's a one-time thing. You don't have to do that every time you create a solution. It's just one time per environment when you first start working with SharePoint Framework. With that done, we can go ahead and run gulp serve to go ahead and play with our solution. What gulp serve actually does whenever you run it is it starts up a web server on your local computer. And you'll notice here it opened a web browser. In this case, we're using Chrome. And within the web browser, we are actually running on the local host. And within this local host, we have a file that we're serving up to the browser called workbench.html. And you'll see right at the top of the window there, it says SharePoint Workbench. This is what is known as SharePoint's local workbench, and you can actually develop your SharePoint web parts locally without having an internet connection because you have this local workbench that serves up your web part and allows you to play with it and test it within a local environment that's not even connected to an actual SharePoint environment. And as you'll see here within my local workbench, I can go ahead and click on this blue plus, and there is our meter web part that we have created. And if I click on that, it's going to add that to the page. And within the local workbench, I can start to test this. I can interact with it. I can view it just as I would view it on an actual SharePoint page once it has been deployed. There may be a lot of aspects of your web parts as you develop them that may require a working live SharePoint environment in order to test them. For example, perhaps your web part reaches out to SharePoint Web Services to retrieve data from your SharePoint environment. And in that case, you will require a live SharePoint environment in which you can test. And for those purposes, you also have what is known as the remote SharePoint Workbench. In order to get to your remote SharePoint Workbench while you have your local workbench up and running, you can go to a new tab and type in the address of your SharePoint online tenant, which in my case is orc.sharepoint.com. And I have a site collection at sites/Kyle. And then on the end of your site collection web address, you can add _layouts/15/workbench.aspx. This is a special URL that is available on all SharePoint Online tenants. And this URL, once you launch it, looks a lot like the local SharePoint workbench. However, the big difference here is that we are online and we are authenticated and we are live within a real SharePoint environment where we can connect to real SharePoint data and test the real Office 365 web services online. And this works very similarly to the local workbench. I can go ahead and click on the blue plus here. I will have more options in this case because we can see all of the SharePoint Framework web parts that are available in this particular environment. But if I scroll down, you will eventually see our meter web part right here. And just like in our local workbench, I'm viewing our locally served SharePoint web part. The only difference is that whenever we make an update to our web part, our local workbench will refresh automatically and show us those changes. However, in the remote workbench, we do actually need to hit the refresh button to see any changes. But otherwise, everything is going to be the same both in the local and the remote workbench, and you can do your testing in both of these tabs or just one, depending on the type of functionality that you're building within your web part itself. Just to demonstrate this functionality within our local workbench tab in our web browser, we're going to leave that open and we're going to go back to our terminal, and I want to open up this solution in Visual Studio Code. Now this process continues to run within the terminal here, so I can't actually type any new commands in because the web server is actively running. But what I can do is open a new tab within the terminal and I can run commands from here. And within this new tab, I'm just gonna run the code command on the current directory to open that up. Within Visual Studio Code, we can start to look at our solution and learn how to navigate the folder and file structure that the Yeoman template generator has set up for us. Most of the work you're going to be doing is going to be within the source or SRC folder. In this case, we have a folder within that called web parts, and there is our meter web part that we have created. Within meter web part.ts, you will notice quite a few things in here. There's some imports, there's some methods, and if it's the first time you've opened up a web part file, it may feel a bit intimidating. But the good news is you really don't have to mess with a lot of this stuff. The big things that you want to be aware of within this file are we have a meter web part class. This is the logic. This is the rendering template. This is all of the functionality for your web part. It's all going to be contained within this class meter web part. So for example, if you want to control how this web part renders to the page, there is a render method within this class. And if we scroll down just a bit, you can see the render method is basically creating an ES6 template string that has some divs and spans and paragraphs within it. This is just HTML at this point. And if we close our sidebar and we shrink our window down a bit so that we can see our web browser over here on the right, you will see how this corresponds to the rendered output that we see in our local workbench. So for example, we have welcome to SharePoint here. There is the string welcome to SharePoint right inside of our render template. So if we want to say welcome to meter web part, we just change that string over on the left in our render method. And as soon as I hit save, you will notice the local workbench refreshes and we can see that updated here. And if you're working on the remote workbench, you'll notice over here it hasn't refreshed. And if we do a manual refresh, sure enough, we get the latest rendered HTML in our remote workbench. There are some other methods within this meter web part class, and we're going to take a look at those in just a moment. But for now, the first thing I pretty much always do when creating a new web part is to take all of this boilerplate, which is really just temporary HTML that Microsoft has set up for us. And let's go ahead and delete that and put in some very basic HTML of our own. So we'll call this meter web part, and we'll just put that in an H1 tag, and then we'll have a paragraph that says hello, or whatever you want there. And as soon as we save that, you'll see all that blue box, all of that boilerplate HTML and styles that Microsoft had given us when we first set up this web part is all gone, and we're back to a blank slate. But this isn't very exciting, is it? Most of the time when you're writing your web parts, this is not the way you're going to do it. You're not just going to hard code some HTML into the render template and call it a day. As developers, we're building all kinds of complex solutions in our applications, and as such, we're going to need our web part to support some sort of input-output in order to ramp up the complexity and allow users to actually interact with it in some way. One of the most important aspects in working with SharePoint Framework web parts is to learn how to utilize and leverage web part properties. Whenever you first set up your first SharePoint Framework web part in the boilerplate that Microsoft gives us, you do actually already have a web part property configured for you. And if you were to go into your workbench and click on the little pencil icon or the Edit Web Part button, you'll notice that over on the panel, the property pane that opens up, we have a description field. And in this case, it has a default value of just meter, but it's not actually doing anything at this point. This is just something that you get by default as a default web part property, and you can choose to delete it, to add new web part properties, or whatever you want. The choice is yours. In order to actually utilize this in our render template, what we can do is over in our code here, rather than just hard coding hello there, let's go ahead and add an expression into our ES6 template string. And within here, we're just going to say this.properties.description. And that's how you access your web part properties, is use this.properties. And as we save, you can see over on the right, we now have meter as our paragraph tag down below. And with that in place, as we update the description field over on the right, you'll see in real time our template, our render template, is actually updating on the left in the web part view itself. And this is a really easy way to allow your content authors and your page authors to edit the content of your web part and control the way it renders through simple web part properties. In this case, we only have a single web part property, but let's say we decide we want to make the title also editable. Maybe we want the content authors to be able to specify what the title or what appears in the H1 tag within this web part. In order to do that, we're going to have to create a new web part property. Web part properties actually have to be updated in 3 separate places whenever you first create them at a minimum. And that may seem a bit tedious the first couple of times you do it, but to be honest, this is something you're going to do very often when you're creating SharePoint Framework web parts, and after a couple times, it's really going to become second nature. And the first of those 3 places is going to be in this webpart.ts file that we have open. And if we scroll up just a bit, you will notice that this file has an interface in it called iMeterWebPartProps. And we're going to learn more about interfaces in an upcoming lesson, but for now, just know that this interface is describing what web part properties are available in this particular web part. And if we want to add a new one, we can just copy, just like we have a description, which is of type string. Maybe I want to add a new one called title, which is also of type string. And with that added, I could potentially, you might think you might be able to go down here to your render template and add this.properties.title. Whoops, not description, title. But as we save this, it is going to update the render template. However, you're going to see undefined because we haven't defined a value for our title web part property. And not only that, but when you go in to edit this web part, there is nowhere to actually edit that web part property. So that's why we need to update this in multiple places. We're going to have to go to the second place where we need to update this, which is called our web part manifest file. You can find this in the sidebar right next to your webpart.ts file. You'll notice there is a JSON file called meterwebpart.manifest.json. Let's go ahead and open this up. And we'll shrink the sidebar back down. And within this file, it basically contains some configuration for this particular web part. This was set up automatically by the Yeoman template generator. And you don't have to change most of the settings in this file. However, there's a particular entry in here that we are interested in that's going to allow us to change what web part properties are available to this web part. And if you scroll all the way down, there is an array of pre-configured entries. And it's using the square brackets to indicate it's an array. And within that, you have these objects. And each of these objects is a setting for this web part. You'll notice it has things like the title of the web part and the description, but then there's an object down below that contains the web part property definitions as well as their default values. And just as before, we have only a single property called description, which has a default value of meter. We want to add a new property in this case. Let's go ahead and add that to our object. This is going to be called title, and let's just have a blank string as our default value in this case. As we save that, it's still not going to fix our undefined problem over on the right. You'll see that's still undefined because even though we've defined this in our manifest and we've added it to the interface in our webpart.ts file, we have not yet made this available to content authors to actually edit the title webpart property. And that's the last step. So let's jump back in. We can close our manifest file. We'll jump back into our webpart.ts file. And as you scroll down, below our render template within this class, you will notice a method called getPropertyPaneConfiguration. This method controls what you see whenever you click on the Edit Webpart or that pencil icon, and this property pane panel opens up on the right. If you ever want to change anything in your Webpart property pane, this is going to be the place to go. In particular, in this case, we want to add a new field or a text box that's going to allow us to edit the title webpart property. The easiest way to do that is to come down to group fields where you can see we already have a text field or a property pane text field for the description webpart property. So that is actually what is allowing us to have this description field text box that appears in our property pane. And if we want to add a new one, this is within an array called group fields. All we have to do is duplicate this. So maybe I want it to appear up above the description, and we will just change this property pane text field to have a different target property of title. And for the label, SharePoint Framework web parts use string localization, which we're going to cover in a future lesson. But for now, I'm just going to go ahead and hard code this as title. And as we save that, whenever we come into our web part and we edit it, you'll now see a new title field in our property pane. And as we type a title here, you can see it update in real time. And this might seem really super simple to have an editable text box over on the right and have that show up in your rendered web part on the left, but this is actually very powerful in practice because what we've created here is interaction between the page author and our actual render template. So as you can imagine, you can have editable properties in your property pane that content authors can come in and change the value of, and then you could do some very complex things with that within your render template over on the left. We're going to keep this fairly simple for now, but we're certainly going to ramp up the complexity as we build more complex solutions in future lessons. Let's go through that process one more time just to make sure we all have the webpart properties down pat. So once again, in our webpart.ts file, let's find our interface, which is called iMeterWebPartProps. And I'm going to create a new webpart property here that is called percentage that is of type number. And we haven't talked a lot about what we're actually doing in this meter webpart. And the reason we're calling it a meter is because I want to be able to show some sort of progress, some sort of percentage between 0 and 100 of a project or a product that we're working on or anything that we want. And we can use this web part to display the status of something using this percentage value. So let's save that, and let's also open up our sidebar. And just as we did before, we're going to go to the second place we need to edit, which is in our web part manifest file. And within the properties object in the pre-configured entries array, we're going to add a default value for percentage, which is going to be 0. And let's go ahead and save that and close this file. And finally, we need a text box to be able to enter the value of our percentage. So the third place we always go when we're working with new web part properties is to our getPropertyPaneConfiguration method. And within there, just as before, we're going to go to our group fields. We're going to duplicate one of these. Make sure to add a comma because it is an array. And on that bottom one, we're going to change our target property to percentage, and we'll give that a label of percentage. And with that done, we now have in our property pane a new text box where we can enter the percentage. So we can enter 75, for example. And we now need to use that in our rendered web part HTML in order to actually see that value. So let's go to our render method up above here, and let's just add a div down below, and we'll add an expression for this .properties percentage, and we'll put a percent after that and close off the div to finish that up. And there we go. We have a working web part. We can enter the percentage. We can enter our title and description that we want to display within that, but it's still not very exciting. We have a very boring text display of 3 fields. We haven't done a lot with this visually or from a user experience perspective. So let's spice things up just a little bit to make sure we have a web part that we would actually want to use in our SharePoint Framework pages. In order to make our value or our percentage in our meter web part look a little more visually interesting, we're going to be using a technique by Mark Carone. You can find the link to his Medium post that explains exactly how this works in the description of the video below. And what Mark has done is he's basically created a donut style pie chart using SVG. And we can drop this into our web part to transform the value from a boring text value into a nice stylized SVG chart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste some of Mark's code directly into our web part and replace our div where we're outputting the percentage with this SVG code. And if we just give that a quick save, we can actually see that in the local workbench and see how our donut style pie chart appears. And this is not wired up to our SharePoint web part property just yet. But before we do that, let's take a look at the SVG and just try to understand, first of all, how it works. And Mark has actually done this very cleverly. It looks a little bit like nonsense when you first paste it in because it has these crazy long numbers with these 15.9, blah, 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 blah. But really, it's actually very clever because you'll notice that you only need to update your percentage that you want to display in that donut chart in 2 places. So I'm going to make the window a little bit wider here so we can have a better look. And you'll notice, first of all, there is a circle element here, and it has a stroke dash array of 8515. And if I were to change that to 7525 and hit save, you'll notice in the workbench it updates to be 75% filled. If I were to change that to be 1585, obviously it's only going to be 15% filled when that refreshes. And as long as those numbers add up to 100, we are going to be good to go. So that is the donut chart fill itself. And if we want to update the number in the middle, we're just going to update that within this text element down here. So in this case, we would update it to be 15%. And as we save, the text in the middle of the chart will also update. So all we have to do to get this working with our web part prop is to use an expression. And within this expression, we're going to say this.properties.percentage. And then we also need to make sure the second number here is going to be another expression with 100 minus this.properties.percentage. And then let's do the same thing down here. Let's replace the 15 with this.properties.percentage. And if we give that a save in our local workbench, we can now go in and edit the value here, and it's always going to be whatever we type in, which is great. And finally, I would be remiss if we did not do a little bit of styling to this web part to clean it up, clean up the spacing and the font and the rather large 60% that you see very offset from the center of this circle, which is driving my design brain crazy. So let's take a look at the sidebar here. And there's another file next to our webpart.ts file that we haven't opened just yet. And this is called meterwebpart.module.scss, and it is a Sass file. And let's go ahead and open that up and close the sidebar. And just like our HTML and our render function, this comes pre-filled with a lot of boilerplate that we can pretty much get rid of. All of the styles for that blue box that you saw when you first created this web part and first added it to the page, that's what's contained within this file. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this, and the only thing I'm going to leave is this outer.meter class because we are utilizing that. So let's delete everything else here, and let's add a couple of styles just to make our web part look a little bit nicer. So first of all, I'm going to add an H1 tag. That's going to allow us to style the H1 that appears at the very top here. And I just want to go ahead and align that to the center. So we'll do a text align center. I want to bring down the font weight to a lightweight font, and let's make it a little bit bigger as well. So we'll change the font size to 2.5 ems. And as we save that, it will update the styles of our title up above, which is looking much better. Let's do the same thing to our paragraph. Let's add a text align center to that so that whenever the paragraph description appears underneath, it's also centered with everything else in the web part. And finally, let's add a little bit of styling for our text value down below, which is in a text element within SVG. So we can just use the text selector, and then we'll say font size, and font sizes within SVG get a little bit weird. So we could open up our inspector here. And this is something you might find yourself doing quite a bit. And within the inspector, what I can do is just play around with the style. So I might say font size 0.75 em, maybe 0.7 looks about right. So we'll add 0.7 ems, and we'll say font weight is 200. And you can't do your normal margins and padding on elements within SVG. So a lot of times if you want to nudge this down a bit, if you will, you're going to have to actually use a transform. So we can, again, play around with this in the browser to get it just right. And we can do a translate Y and maybe do something like 1 em, that's way too far. 0.5 ems, 0.3 looks about right. So if we just copy that, transform and paste that into our CSS, that'll allow that text to be centered. And we brought the weight down as well there. So that's looking much better at this point. We have a very nice styled web part that allows us to change the percentage to whatever we want, and it's going to always update the value in our web part and appear just great. And with that last update, we have a working web part. And as you can imagine, you can now start to think about some real world scenarios where you could utilize this web part. One of the cool things about web parts is they are encapsulated components, meaning if we wanted to switch this to a 2-column layout and we wanted to add another meter web part over to the right, you can see that each one of these web parts has its own scope and its own state that allows it to stay completely encapsulated and separate and segregated from one another, which is going to make it so that you can add as many of these to a page as you like, and you're going to be able to build very nice dashboards that allow you to quickly show the percentage or progress of a particular metric. That's going to do it for this particular web part, and before we move on to making some more complex solutions in the SharePoint framework, I think it's going to be really important to take a step back and look at the technology that we've been using, in particular TypeScript.